everybody, welcome back. It's Christina Wainwright, the manager at the Pacific Beach Library. Thank you for joining me for our second week of our readings of the Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. I hope you're able to catch up on the weekend's readings. There was some interesting things happening, and I gotta say, I'm really excited about what's coming up this week. Okay, so let's go ahead and, before we do a review of what happened last week, hi Pam, good to see you. I'm gonna start with the tea, and just because I got some mangoes at the store the other day, I couldn't resist having some orange mango tea today. We've had this one before, but I'm just gonna, for anyone who is new to the group, it's a lovely tea. It's an orange mango fruit infusion, and it says it's made with orange slices, mango cubes, pineapple, safflower, marigold blossoms, and strawberries. It is, I think, one of the prettier teas we've had. It's this beautiful golden yellow color. It's absolutely stunning. So I'm just going to press it in our press and then pour it out into the tea mug. And it's just such a beautiful color. It just, yeah, it's more of a yellow, but it has that just tinge of gold and orangey in there too. It's so good smelling. Oh, it's so good. I'm just gonna have to wait for it to cool down a little bit so I can enjoy that a little bit less tentatively. But it's delicious. Okay, so what happened on Friday's readings? On Friday, we actually read 3 short chapters, chapters 9, 10, and 11, and we'll go ahead and catch up what happened there. So in the previous day, Edmond Dantes was imprisoned in the Chateau d'If, and we know that he was falsely imprisoned, that he was, through various things that all went wrong for him, through the conspiring of his friends and colleagues, Danglars, and then his neighbor Caderousse, and then also Fernand, the cousin of Mercédès, who's in love with her and is jealous of Dantes. But then also he has the bad misfortune that when he goes before a judge, or excuse me, an attorney, Monsieur de Villefort is the one man who could not allow him to go free despite believing in Dantes' innocence, because he recognizes the name on the letter that Dantes is carrying, which is the name of Villefort's father, Noirtier. And because of this, Villefort, even though he knows that Dantes is innocent, condemns Dantes to imprisonment in the Chateau d'If. So what we see in chapter 9 is that Villefort, having sent Dantes off to imprisonment, he goes back to where his betrothal party was going on. He speaks to his future in-laws, and he says basically to his future father-in-law, I need your help. I need you to get me an audience with the king, because I know something that will benefit me greatly, and ultimately that benefits you as well because they're going to be family, but I need to speak to the king. And so then he rushes off to go to see the king to Paris. Then in chapter 10, we see a conversation between King Louis XVIII, who is speaking with Monsieur de Blacas and also Monsieur d'André. And the two gentlemen are trying to convince the king that they need to speak to him about important things. And the king is sort of like, he's just sort of not listening to them. He's got his own interests and he's not really caring. And then finally they're able to convince him to listen to them. And they realize that because Monsieur de Blacas at least had been informed of Villefort having some sort of secret information that would benefit the kingdom, he brings in Villefort, who tells the king that indeed Napoleon is on his way, that he has left Elba and that he's trying to infiltrate France again. And the king is like, absolutely doesn't believe it. There's no way. Monsieur d'André is his chief of police, and he is going to, he just went back to the office basically to check the files to make sure that there's no such intelligence they received. And when he comes back, he actually does confirm that the usurper has left Elba and is landed in France. And so because he confirms Villefort's news like this, the king now trusts Villefort, and he tries to reward him. He gives him a special pin from the Legion of Honor, and good things are happening for Villefort now. He has received the king's trust and gratitude because he's brought this news about, which he says, came through Dantes. He admits that much at least, but that there had been a betrayer. But he does not, of course, reveal that the person who was supposed to receive the information was his own father, Noirtier. While he's talking with the king, and the king is getting his intelligence report from the other two gentlemen, though, he does learn that there was recently a murder of a double agent, a general who had been pretending to be a Bonapartist, but of course was really loyal to the king, and that person was killed by a gentleman who exactly matches the description of Noirtier, who we meet at the end of the chapter, who has gone to see his son. So, before we go into chapter 12, which is called Father and Son, which again is a parallel to what we saw earlier in the book between Dantes and his own father, here we're going to meet Noirtier and Villefort, and so we'll see what happens there. But I just did want to remind you about the history of what's going on in this period. Napoleon had been the Emperor of France. He was deposed. He was exiled to the island of Elba. And again, this book is set in a very interesting period of France where Napoleon escapes from Elba, returns to France, briefly takes over the kingdom again, and he actually stays in power for approximately 100 days before the Battle of Waterloo crushes his aspirations to retake the control of France and indeed of Europe altogether. And so what we're seeing here is the midst of what's later known as the 100 Days of France, in the middle of the Bourbon Restoration, when Napoleon does come back into power. And so right now we're just at the beginning of those 100 days. Napoleon has come back. The king is still in power, but there's a lot of, the politics are in flux right now, and it's a very tumultuous time. Okay, so now we have that background. Let's go in and read chapter 12 of the Count of Monte Cristo. Today we're going to read 2 chapters, chapters 12 and 13. Father and Son is the title of chapter 12. And let's get started. Monsieur Noirtier, for it was indeed he who entered, looked after the servant until the door was closed, and then, fearing no doubt that he might be overheard in the antechamber, he opened the door again. Nor was the precaution useless, as appeared from the rapid retreat of Germain, who proved that he was not exempt from the sin which ruined our first parents. Monsieur Noirtier then took the trouble to close and bolt the antechamber door, then that of the bedchamber, and then extended his hand to Villefort, who had followed all his motions with surprise which he could not conceal. "Well now, my dear Gerard," said he to the young man, with a very significant look, "do you know, you seem as if you were not very glad to see me." "My dear father," said Villefort, "I am on the contrary delighted, but I so little expected your visit that it has somewhat overcome me." "But, my dear fellow," replied Monsieur Noirtier, seating himself, "I might say the same thing to you, when you announced to me your wedding for the 28th of February, and on the 3rd of March you turn up here in Paris." "And if I have come, my dear father," said Gerard, drawing closer to Monsieur Noirtier, "do not complain, for it is for you that I came, and my journey will be your salvation." "Ah, indeed," said Monsieur Noirtier, stretching himself out at his ease in the chair. "Really, pray tell me all about it, for it must be interesting." "Father, you have heard speak of a certain Bonapartist club in the Rue Saint-Jacques?" "Number 53. Yes, I am vice president." "Father, your coolness makes me shudder." "Why, my dear boy, when a man has been proscribed by the mountaineers, has escaped from Paris in a hay cart, been hunted over the plains of Bordeaux by Robespierre's bloodhounds, he becomes accustomed to most things. But go on. What about the club in the Rue Saint-Jacques?" "Why, they induced General Quesnel to go there, and General Quesnel, who quitted his own house at 9 o'clock in the evening, was found the next day in the Seine." "And who told you this fine story?" "The king himself." "Well then, in return for your story," continued Noirtier, "I will tell you another." "My dear father, I think I already know what you are about to tell me." "Ah, you have heard of the landing of the emperor?" "Not so loud, father, I entreat of you, for your own sake as well as mine. Yes, I heard this news, and knew it even before you could, for 3 days ago I posted from Marseille to Paris with all possible speed, half desperate at the enforced delay." "3 days ago? You are crazy. Why, 3 days ago the emperor had not landed." "No matter. I was aware of his intention." "How did you know about it?" "By a letter addressed to you from the island of Elba." "To me?" "To you, and which I discovered in the pocketbook of the messenger. Had that letter fallen into the hands of another, you, my dear father, would probably ere this have been shot." Villefort's father laughed. Come, come, said he. Will the Restoration adopt imperial methods so promptly? Shot, my dear boy? What an idea. Where is the letter you speak of? I know you too well to suppose you would allow such a thing to pass you. I burnt it, for fear that even a fragment should remain, for that letter must have led to your condemnation. And the destruction of your future prospects, replied Noirtier. Yes, I can easily comprehend that, but I have nothing to fear while I have you to protect me. I do better than that, sir. I save you. You do? Why, really, the thing becomes more and more dramatic. Explain yourself. I must refer again to the club in the Rue Saint-Jacques. It appears that this club is rather a bore to the police. Why didn't they search more vigilantly? They would have found. They have not found, but they are on the track. Yes, that is the usual phrase. I am quite familiar with it. When the police is at fault, it declares that it is on the track, and the government patiently awaits the day when it comes to say, with a sneaking air, that the track is lost. Yes, but they have found a corpse. The general has been killed, and in all countries they call that a murder. A murder, do you call it? Why, there is nothing to prove that the general was murdered. People are found every day in the Seine, having thrown themselves in, or having been drowned from not knowing how to swim. Father, you know very well that the general was not a man to drown himself in despair, and people do not bathe in the Seine in the month of January. No, no, do not be deceived. This was murder in every sense of the word. And who thus designated it? The king himself. The king. I thought he was philosopher enough to allow that there was no murder in politics. In politics, my dear fellow, you know, as well as I do, there are no men but ideas, no feelings but interests. In politics, we do not kill a man, we only remove an obstacle. That is all. Would you like to know how matters have progressed? Well, I will tell you. It was thought reliance might be placed in General Quesnel. He was recommended to us from the island of Elba. One of us went to him and invited him to the Rue Saint-Jacques, where he would find some friends. He came there, and the plan was unfolded to him for leaving Elba, the projected landing, etc. When he had heard and comprehended all to the fullest extent, he replied that he was a royalist. Then all looked at each other. He was made to take an oath, and did so, but with such an ill grace that it was really tempting Providence to swear thus. And yet, in spite of that, the general was allowed to depart free, perfectly free. Yet he did not return home. What could that mean? Why, my dear fellow, that on leaving us he lost his way. That's all. A murder? Really, Villefort, you surprise me. You, a deputy procurer, to found an accusation on such bad premises. Did I ever say to you, when you were fulfilling your character as a royalist, and cut off the head of one of my party, my son, you have committed a murder? No, I said, very well, sir, you have gained the victory. Tomorrow, perhaps, it will be our turn. But, father, take care. When our turn comes, our revenge will be sweeping. I do not understand you. You rely on the usurper's return? We do. You are mistaken. He will not advance 2 leagues into the interior of France without being followed, tracked, and caught like a wild beast. My dear fellow, the emperor is at this moment on the way to Grenoble, and on the 10th or 12th he will be at Lyon, and on the 20th or 25th at Paris. The people will rise. Yes, to go and meet him. He has but a handful of men with him, and armies will be dispatched against him. Yes, to escort him into the capital. Really, my dear Gerard, you are but a child. You think yourself well informed because the telegraph has told you, 3 days after the landing, the usurper has landed at Cannes with several men. He is pursued. But where is he? What is he doing? You do not know it all, and in this way they will chase him to Paris without drawing a trigger. Grenoble and Lyon are faithful cities, and will oppose to him an impassable barrier. Grenoble will open her gates to him with enthusiasm. All Lyon will hasten to welcome him. Believe me, we are as well informed as you, and our police are as good as your own. Would you like a proof of it? Well, you wish to conceal your journey from me, and yet I knew of your arrival half an hour after you had passed the barrier. You gave your direction to no one but your postilion, yet I have your address, and in proof I am here the very instant you are going to sit at table. Ring then, if you please, for a second knife, fork, and plate, and we will dine together. Indeed, replied Villefort, looking at his father with astonishment. You really do seem very well informed. The thing is simple enough. You who are in power have only the means that money produces. We who are in expectation have those whom devotion prompts. Devotion, said Villefort with a sneer. Yes, devotion, for that is, I believe, the phrase for hopeful ambition. And Villefort's father extended his hand to the bell-rope to summon the servant whom his son had not called. Villefort caught his arm. Wait, my dear father, said the young man. One word more. Say on. However stupid the royalist police may be, they do know one terrible thing. What is that? The description of the man who, on the morning of the day when General Quesnel disappeared, presented himself at his house. Oh, the admirable police have found that out, have they? And what may be that description? Dark complexion, hair, eyebrows, and whiskers black, blue frock coat buttoned up to the chin, rosette of an officer of the Legion of Honor in his buttonhole, a hat with wide brim, and a cane. Aha, that's it, is it? Said Noirtier. And why, then, have they not laid hands on him? Because yesterday or the day before, they lost sight of him at the corner of the Rue Coqueron. Didn't I say that your police were good for nothing? Yes, but they may catch him yet. True, said Noirtier, looking carelessly around him. True, if this person were not on his guard, as he is, and he added with a smile, he will consequently make a few changes in his personal appearance. At these words he rose, and put off his frock coat and cravat, went towards a table on which lay his son's toilette articles, lathered his face, took a razor, and with a firm hand cut off the compromising whiskers. Villefort watched him with alarm, not devoid of admiration. His whiskers cut off, Noirtier gave another turn to his hair, took, instead of his black cravat, a colored neckerchief which lay at the top of an open portmanteau, put it on, in lieu of his blue and high-buttoned frock coat, a coat of Villefort's of dark brown, and cut away in front, tried on before the glass a narrow-brimmed hat of his son's, which appeared to fit him perfectly, and leaving his cane in the corner where he had deposited it, he took up a small bamboo switch, cut the air with it once or twice, and walked about with that easy swagger which was one of his principal characteristics. Well, said he, turning towards his wondering son when this disguise was completed. Well, do you think your police will recognize me now? No, father, stammered Villefort. At least, I hope not. And now, my dear boy, continued Noirtier, I rely on your prudence to remove all the things which I leave in your care. Oh, rely on me, said Villefort. Yes, yes, and now I believe you are right, and that you have really saved my life. Be assured, I will return the favor hereafter. Villefort shook his head. You are not convinced yet? I hope at least that you may be mistaken. Shall you see the king again? Perhaps. Would you pass in his eyes for a prophet? Prophets of evil are not in favor at the court, father. True, but some day they do them justice. And supposing a second restoration, you would then pass for a great man. Well, what should I say to the king? Say this to him. Sire, you are deceived as to the feeling in France. as to opinions of the towns and the prejudices of the army. He whom in Paris you call the Corsican ogre, who at Nevers is styled the usurper, is already saluted as Bonaparte at Lyon and emperor at Grenoble. You think he is tracked, pursued, captured? He is advancing as rapidly as his own eagles. The soldiers you believe to be dying with hunger, worn out with fatigue, ready to desert, gather like atoms of snow about the rolling ball as it hastens onward. Sire, go, leave France to its real master, to him who acquired it, not by purchase, but by right of conquest. Go, sire, not that you incur any risk, for your adversary is powerful enough to show you mercy, but because it would be humiliating for a grandson of Saint Louis to owe his life to the man of Arcola, Marengo, Austerlitz. Tell him this, Gerard, or rather, tell him nothing. Keep your journey a secret. Do not boast of what you have come to Paris to do, or have done. Return with all speed, enter Marseille at night, and your house by the back door, and there remain quiet, submissive, secret, and above all inoffensive. For this time, I swear to you, we shall act like powerful men who know their enemies. Go, my son. Go, my dear Gerard, and by your obedience to my paternal orders, or if you prefer it, friendly counsels, we will keep you in your place. This will be, added Noirtier with a smile, one means by which you may a second time save me, if the political balance should some day take another turn, and cast you aloft while hurling me down. Adieu, my dear Gerard, and at your next journey, alight at my door. Noirtier left the room when he had finished with the same calmness that had characterized him during the whole of this remarkable and trying conversation. Villefort, pale and agitated, ran to the window, put aside the curtain, and saw him pass, cool and collected, by 2 or 3 ill-looking men at the corner of the street, who were there perhaps to arrest a man with black whiskers and a blue frock-coat and hat with broad brim. Villefort stood watching, breathless, until his father had disappeared at the Rue Bussy. Then he turned to the various articles he had left behind him, put the black cravat and blue frock-coat at the bottom of the portmanteau, threw the hat into a dark closet, broke the cane into small bits and flung it in the fire, put on his traveling cap, and calling his valet, checked with a look the 1,000 questions he was ready to ask, paid his bill, sprang into his carriage, which was ready, learned at Lyon that Bonaparte had entered Grenoble, and in the midst of the tumult which prevailed along the road, at length reached Marseille, a prey to all the hopes and fears which enter into the heart of a man with ambition and its first successes. And now chapter 13, The 100 Days. Monsieur Noirtier was a true prophet, and things progressed rapidly, as he had predicted. Everyone knows the history of the famous return from Elba, a return which was unprecedented in the past and will probably remain without a counterpart in the future. Louis XVIII made but a faint attempt to parry this unexpected blow. The monarchy he had scarcely reconstructed tottered on its precarious foundation, and at a sign from the emperor the incongruous structure of ancient prejudices and new ideas fell to the ground. Villefort therefore gained nothing save the king's gratitude, which was rather likely to injure him at the present time, and the cross of the Legion of Honor, which he had the prudence not to wear, although Monsieur de Blacas had duly forwarded the brevet. Napoleon would doubtless have deprived Villefort of his office had it not been for Noirtier, who was all-powerful at court, and thus the Girondin of '93 and the senator of 1806 protected him who so lately had been his protector. All Villefort's influence barely enabled him to stifle the secret Dantes had so nearly divulged. The king's procureur alone was deprived of his office, being suspected of royalism. However, scarcely was the imperial power established. That is, scarcely had the emperor re-entered the Tuileries and begun to issue orders from the closet into which we have introduced our readers, he found on the table where Louis XVIII's half-filled snuff box. Scarcely had this occurred when Marseille began, in spite of the authorities, to rekindle the flames of civil war, always smoldering in the south, and it required but little to excite the populace to acts of far greater violence than the shouts and insults with which they assailed the royalists whenever they ventured abroad. Owing to this change, the worthy shipowner became at that moment, we will not say all-powerful, because Morel was a prudent and rather a timid man, so much so that many of the most zealous partisans of Bonaparte accused him of moderation, but sufficiently influential to make a demand in favor of Dantes. Villefort retained his place, but his marriage was put off until a more favorable opportunity. If the emperor remained on the throne, Gerard required a different alliance to aid his career. If Louis XVIII returned, the influence of Monsieur de Saint-Méran, like his own, could be vastly increased, and the marriage be still more suitable. The deputy procureur was therefore the first magistrate of Marseille when one morning his door opened, and Monsieur Morel was announced. Anyone else would have hastened to receive him, but Villefort was a man of ability, and he knew this would be a sign of weakness. He made Morel wait in the antechamber, though he had no one with him, for the simple reason that the king's procureur always makes everyone wait. And after passing a quarter of an hour in reading the papers, he ordered Monsieur Morel to be admitted. Morel expected Villefort would be dejected. He found him as he had found him 6 weeks before, calm, firm, and full of that glacial politeness, that most insurmountable barrier which separates the well-bred from the vulgar man. He had entered Villefort's office expecting that the magistrate would tremble at the sight of him. On the contrary, he felt a cold shudder all over him when he saw Villefort sitting there with his elbow on his desk and his head leaning on his hand. He stopped at the door. Villefort gazed at him as if he had some difficulty in recognizing him. Then, after a brief interval, during which the honest shipowner turned his hat in his hands, "Monsieur Morel, I believe," said Villefort. "Yes, sir." "Come nearer," said the magistrate, with a patronizing wave of the hand, "and tell me to what circumstance I owe the honor of this visit." "Do you not guess, sir?" asked Morel. "Not in the least. But if I can serve you in any way, I shall be delighted." "Everything depends on you." "Explain yourself, pray." "Monsieur," said Morel, recovering his assurance as he proceeded, "do you recollect that a few days before the landing of His Majesty the Emperor, I came to intercede for a young man, the mate of my ship, who was accused of being concerned in correspondence with the island of Elba? What was the other day a crime is today a title to favor. You then served Louis XVIII, and you did not show any favor. It was your duty. Today you serve Napoleon, and you ought to protect him. It is equally your duty. I come, therefore, to ask what has become of him." Villefort, by a strong effort, sought to control himself. "What is his name?" said he. "Tell me his name." "Edmond Dantes." Villefort would probably have rather stood opposite the muzzle of a pistol at 25 paces than have heard this name spoken, but he did not blanch. "Dantes," repeated he. "Edmond Dantes." "Yes, monsieur." Villefort opened a large register, then went to a table. From the table, turned to his registers, and then, turning to Morel, "Are you quite sure you are not mistaken, monsieur?" said he, in the most natural tone in the world. Had Morel been a more quick-sighted man, or better versed in these matters, he would have been surprised at the king's procureur answering him on such a subject, instead of referring him to the governors of the prison or the prefect of the department. But Morel, disappointed in his expectations of exciting fear, was conscious only of the other's condescension. Villefort had calculated rightly. "No," said Morel, "I am not mistaken. I have known him for 10 years, the last 4 of which he was in my service. Do not you recollect, I came about 6 weeks ago to plead for clemency, as I come today to plead for justice. You received me very coldly. Oh, the royalists were very severe with the Bonapartists in those days." "Monsieur," returned Villefort, "I was then a royalist, because I believed the Bourbons not only the heirs to the throne, but the chosen of the nation. The miraculous return of Napoleon has conquered me. The legitimate monarch is he who is loved by his people." "That's right," cried Morel. "I like to hear you speak thus, and I augur well for Edmond from it." Wait a moment, said Villefort, turning over the leaves of register. I have it. A sailor who was about to marry a young Catalan girl? I recollect now. It was a very serious charge. How so? You know that when he left here he was taken to the Palais de Justice. Well, I made my report to the authorities at Paris, and a week after he was carried off. Carried off? Said Morel. What can they have done with him? Oh, he has been taken to Fenestrelles, to Pignerol, or to the Sainte Marguerite Islands. Some fine morning he will return to take command of your vessel. Come when he will, it shall be kept for him. But how is it he has not already returned? It seemed to me the first care of government should be to set at liberty those who have suffered for their adherence to it. Do not be too hasty, Monsieur Morel, replied Villefort. The order of imprisonment came from high authority, and the order for his liberation must proceed from the same source. And as Napoleon has scarcely been reinstated a fortnight, the letters have not yet been forwarded. But, said Morel, is there no way of expediting all these formalities, of releasing him from arrest? There has been no arrest. How? It is sometimes essential to government to cause a man's disappearance without leaving any traces, so that no written forms or documents may defeat their wishes. It might be so under the Bourbons, but at present it has always been so, my dear Morel, since the reign of Louis XIV. The emperor is more strict in prison discipline than even Louis himself, and the number of prisoners whose names are not on the register is incalculable. Had Morel even any suspicions, so much kindness would have dispelled them. Well, Monsieur Villefort, how would you advise me to act? Asked he. Petition the minister. Oh, I know what that is. The minister receives 200 petitions every day and does not read 3. That is true, but he will read a petition countersigned and presented by me. And will you undertake to deliver it? With the greatest pleasure. Dantes was then guilty, and now he is innocent, and it is as much my duty to free him as it was to condemn him. Villefort thus forestalled any danger of an inquiry, which, however improbable it might be, if it did take place, would leave him defenseless. But how shall I address the minister? Sit down there, said Villefort, giving up his place to Morel, and write what I dictate. Will you be so good? Certainly, but lose no time. We have lost too much already. That is true. Only think what the poor fellow may even now be suffering. Villefort shuddered at the suggestion, but he had gone too far to draw back. Dantes must be crushed to gratify Villefort's ambition. Villefort dictated a petition in which, from an excellent intention no doubt, Dantes's patriotic services were exaggerated, and he was made out one of the most active agents of Napoleon's return. It was evident that at the sight of this document, the minister would instantly receive him. The petition finished, Villefort read it aloud. That will do, said he. Leave the rest to me. Will the petition go soon? Today. Countersigned by you? The best thing I can do will be to certify the truth of the contents of your petition. And sitting down, Villefort wrote the certificate at the bottom. What more is to be done? I will do whatever is necessary. This assurance delighted Morel, who took leave of Villefort and hastened to announce to old Dantes that he would soon see his son. As for Villefort, instead of sending to Paris, he carefully preserved the petition that so fearfully compromised Dantes in the hopes of an event that seemed not unlikely, that is, a second restoration. Dantes remained a prisoner and heard not the noise of the fall of Louis XVIII's throne or the still more tragic destruction of the empire. Twice during the 100 days had Morel renewed his demand, and twice had Villefort soothed him with promises. At last there was Waterloo, and Morel came no more. He had done all that was in his power, and any fresh attempt would only compromise himself uselessly. Louis XVIII remounted the throne. Villefort, to whom Marseille had become filled with remorseful memories, sought and obtained the situation of king's procureur at Toulouse, and a fortnight afterwards he married Mademoiselle de Saint-Méran, whose father now stood higher at court than ever. And so Dantes, after the 100 days and after Waterloo, remained in his dungeon, forgotten of earth and heaven. Danglars comprehended the full extent of the wretched fate that overwhelmed Dantes, and when Napoleon returned to France, he, after the manner of mediocre minds, termed the coincidence a decree of Providence. But when Napoleon returned to Paris, Danglars' heart failed him, and he lived in constant fear of Dantes's return on a mission of vengeance. He therefore informed M. Morel of his wish to quit the sea, and obtained a recommendation from him to a Spanish merchant into his service he entered at the end of March, that is, 10 or 12 days after Napoleon's return. He then left for Madrid and was no more heard of. Fernand understood nothing except that Dantes was absent. What had become of him, he cared not to inquire. Only, during the respite the absence of his rival afforded him, he reflected, partly on the means of deceiving Mercédès as to the cause of his absence, partly on plans of immigration and abduction, as from time to time he sat sad and motionless on the summit of Cape Pharo, at the spot from whence Marseille and the Catalan are visible, watching for the apparition of a young and handsome man, who was for him also the messenger of vengeance. Fernand's mind was made up. He would shoot Dantes and then kill himself. But Fernand was mistaken. A man of his disposition never kills himself, for he constantly hopes. During this time, the emperor made its last conscription, and every man in France capable of bearing arms rushed to obey the summons of the emperor. Fernand departed with the rest, bearing with him the terrible thought that while he was away, his rival would perhaps return and marry Mercédès. Had Fernand really meant to kill himself, he would have done so when he parted from Mercédès. His devotion and the compassion he showed for her misfortunes produced the effect they always produce on noble minds. Mercédès had always had a sincere regard for Fernand, and this was now strengthened by gratitude. "My brother," said she, as she placed his knapsack on his shoulders, "be careful of yourself, for if you are killed, I shall be alone in the world." And these words carried a ray of hope into Fernand's heart. Should Dantes not return, Mercédès might one day be his. Mercédès was left alone, face to face with the vast plain that had never seemed so barren, and the sea that had never seemed so vast. Bathed in tears, she wandered about the Catalan village. Sometimes she stood mute and motionless as a statue, looking towards Marseille. At other times gazing on the sea, and debating as to whether it were not better to cast herself into the abyss of the ocean, and thus end her woes. It was not want of courage that prevented her putting this resolution into execution, but her religious feelings came to her aid and saved her. Caderousse was, like Fernand, enrolled in the army, but being married and 8 years older, he was merely sent to the frontier. Old Dantes, who was only sustained by hope, lost all hope at Napoleon's downfall. 5 months after he had been separated from his son, and almost at the hour of his arrest, he breathed his last in Mercédès' arms. Monsieur Morel paid the expenses of his funeral and a few small debts the poor old man had contracted. There was more than benevolence in this action. There was courage. The South was aflame, and to assist, even on his deathbed, the father of so dangerous a Bonapartist as Dantes was stigmatized as a crime. And that concludes chapter 13 of the Count of Monte Cristo. Thank you for joining me today. Tomorrow we're going to learn more about what's been going on with Edmond, imprisoned in the Chateau d'If. Thank you for joining me today. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.